Hey guys, this is chess coach Andrew Rankin. Today I want to share with you the first match I played this last weekend at the Las Vegas National Open. My opponent was a 1938 rated Class A player named Colin Diamond. He was white and I was playing as black. Also worth mentioning, Colin is a stand-up guy and we became friends during the tournament. Hopefully we'll become sparring partners as well later on. So the game began with d4. I played d5, he played c4, the Queen's Gambit. I played c6, the Slav defense, and he goes knight to c3. I was pretty happy to see this because this is all pretty standard, and I played e6, hoping to go into knight f3 and then d takes c4, which is your note boom, which can get quite sharp, but you guys know I've played it over the board with success against higher rated opponents than Colin, and I also play it online quite a bit and have very good success with that. And he knew that can get very sharp. And so he played the move e4, hoping to go in a little bit different direction. So he was hoping to play this Slav gambit, is what it's called in Russia, or it's sometimes referred to as the Marshall gambit. But there are like 4 to 5 different Marshall gambits, so it's not very clear when you say the Marshall gambit. And the idea here is that if black plays pawn takes, you play knight takes, and then black can play bishop to b4 check. And when the bishop blocks, you can play queen takes d4. And when the bishop takes your bishop, you take the knight with check, and white can block with either the knight or the bishop. The problem here, though, is that black ends up with some serious dark square weaknesses and can actually end up getting mated quite quickly. So this knight has a hard time developing. The correct move is like knight to d7 after, bishop to e2, knight to d7. And it's all fun for white and no fun for black. So I had no interest in doing that. I did take on e4 and he took back with the knight. But instead here I just played nice and solid knight to f6. And he took, and I took with the queen, and then he went knight to f3. And his idea is pretty simple. He's going to play bishop to g5, and my queen is actually going to start running out of squares really quick. So for example, a line like this, and I think my queen's going to get trapped quite quickly. So because of that, I have to play the move bishop to b4 check. He blocked with the bishop, and I traded bishops. So he took with the queen, and now the next 2 or 3 moves is when white probably has the greatest advantage of the entire game. So I play the knight to d7, and my opponent plays bishop to e2. And really, around this time, white really needs to start considering the move queen to e3. And the reason is because clearly black's entire plan is simply going to break with the with the move e5. And so if he can stop that, then it's kind of annoying, and my bishop is going to be a pretty bad piece on c7. But instead we played pretty normal moves, which is castles and castles. And yeah, so here it wants the queen to e3 first. Because right now I can play e5. And now I can start to get my pieces into the game. He plays the move rook a to d1, which makes a lot of sense. He's bringing his rooks to the 2 open files. I really wanted him to take so that I could move my knight and get my bishop into the game, but he's going to make me work to activate my bishop. But black is just really solid here. I don't think black is ever going to win these kinds of games unless white makes a mistake. But it's also really hard for white to crack black. At this point, the evaluation starts to get close to 0, and it pretty much stays there for the rest of the game. So I took in the center because I realized that he was never going to take. And he took with the queen. I was pretty happy with this because I think once the queens are off, I wasn't too worried about ever losing the game. As long as I stay really solid and anticipate all of his upcoming threats. So I played the move rook to e8, threatening his light square bishop. He defends with rook f to e1. And I decided to trade queens because that's the only way I'm going to get my knight out of the d7 square, and once the knight moves off of d7, only then can I activate my light square bishop. So he takes with the rook. I play knight to f6, and he plays king to f1. I thought this was a really strong move because now I don't have any tactics on the bishop and the rook because they're both defended by the king. I do have the move bishop to g4 though, so if he moves the knight, then I do have this nice check. especially since he moved the rook off of the e file and doubled up on the d file. The problem, though, with this setup for white is that he would love to get a rook onto the 7th rank. If for some reason he could bring a rook to the 7th rank, start raking my 7th, and then double up on the 7th, I think it would be lights out for black. But black's pieces all defend d7, so there are really no entry points into black's position. And I simply play rook to e7. The idea is that I'm going to double up on the e file, and I might even bring my king over and then start to fight on the d file and trade off rooks. So he goes rook to d8. When we analyzed the game, we thought that the move here was not the greatest move, because after rook takes a8, I actually end up with an undeveloped rook. But it turns out that this is actually the top engine line. So my other alternative would be something like rook takes, and then rook here. But I imagine that he would just go back, and we end up with a pretty similar situation. So he now played the move h3, questioning my light square bishop. And if there's any chance of black winning, it has to be through some imbalance. And the idea that I'm going for here after I take and he takes is that I want to trade off the rooks, and I want to play a good knight versus maybe not so good bishop endgame. For example, maybe I can find a weak pawn in a long-term future endgame that's on a dark square, and maybe fork one of his pieces and the pawn and pick up a pawn. And then once you win one pawn, sometimes you can win a second just because of added weaknesses. So at least the knight can fight on the dark squares versus the light square bishop can only fight on half the board. So this was the imbalance that I thought might create some winning chances for me. I play the move king to f8, bringing my king over so that I can eventually trade rooks on the d file. He starts to attack, though, really quickly, and I thought this was really clever because I had to think for a long time to figure out how to deal with this bishop pressure, and then eventually the rook was going to swing over and add some extra pressure. So I play the move a6, and he plays the move a4, and I realized that he's going to rip open the pawn structure over here, and so I thought that rook to c8 was really my best bet, because this pawn would be weak after he pushes and I take, if he takes with like the a pawn, for example, and my rook would get active on an open file. And when he pushed a5, I can bring the rook to c7, so I can guard the b8 pawn laterally. And now he plays the move b5. I don't think the computer is a big fan of this, but I thought that the move a5 was quite clever because he can play the move b5 anyway. And the reason is because after pawn takes, he can play the move rook to b1, and now he's going to win this pawn easily. And he thought that he was going to win my b7 pawn, but I actually have this really nice knight reroute, knight to e8, so that after he takes, I can bring the knight to d6, and I not only guard b7, but I also attack the rook with tempo. He drops the rook back to b1, and the computer wants me to play rook to c5 and then take on a5, but sacrifice the b7 pawn with the bishop takes, knight takes, bishop, and then rook takes. But I went about it a little bit differently. I played knight to c4, and this was not only the only threat that I made in the game, but it was also... so not only is it the first threat and the first time I really had a piece cross the center of the board, but it was the only threat that I made in the game. But that's okay, because that's sometimes how things go. And my threat is pretty simple. I want to play knight to d2, forking the king and the rook. So if he plays a move like bishop takes, he loses on the spot to the knight fork. So, and I'm also attacking the pawn here, so he has to act decisively, and so rook takes b7 is really an only move. Trade rooks, and then I take on a5, and now he drops the bishop back to d5, and his bishop is actually really dominating the knight. The knight has not a single square that he can run away to. So first I play the move f6 so that when I bring the king, his bishop doesn't take one of my pawns. But his king's too far away to really take advantage of my knight being stuck on the side. Because after king to e2, king to e7, king to e3, king to d6, he brings his king into e4, but now I can play knight to c6. And I actually really like black's chances if the knight can jump to e5 or to b4 and start to get behind his position. And so I really thought here if white wanted to fight for a win or a draw, he had to take the knight. And my opponent came to the same conclusion. So we take the knight. I played king takes. And I'm very thankful that I have the pawn on f6 because my king and the pawn actually prevent the king from getting in. He can go king to f5, but my king can come over to d6 and the king can't make any progress. He pushes h4. I go king back to e7. I really want to just get my king to f7 and then play g6 and kick him out. So I do just that. He plays g4. G6, pawn takes, he brings the king back, and I bring the king here. And really what he's going to end up doing is something like this, and we're just going to end up shuffling our kings back and forth. So yeah, the game here, the valuation didn't change very much. We both played excellent. The centi pawn loss for him was 7, and the centi pawn loss for me was 6. So yeah, it was an excellent first game. I was really happy to draw against such a strong opponent. And I'm looking forward to round 2. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that, and take care. Bye.